that I'm here in the boardroom and now have 7 of my colleagues present in the boardroom. It was getting lonely without them, and others are still on Zoom. And we have 2, I believe, Commissioner Grimes and Commissioner McKeon are unable to be with us this evening. But slowly but surely, we find ourselves returning to a world that we knew about 18 months ago. So with that, we have a number of important items for this evening. But the first item will be through our special Board of Commissioners meeting, which I would like to call to order and ask that everybody first please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Only because I'm old school, don't like the designated hitter or the 24-second clock, I'm going to ask our Township Secretary to actually call the roll.
Okay. So Mr. Grimes and Mr. McKeon have asked to be excused. Mr. Churchill. Where'd he go? Oh. Mr. Courtney.
Here.
Mr.
Here.
Mr. Gavin.
Present.
Mr. Grimes. Oh, Mr. Grimes is excused. Ms. Kramer. Here. Mr. McComb.
Here.
Ms. O'Neill.
Here.
Mr. Sinai.
Here.
Mr. Stevenson.
Present.
Mr. Whalen. Oh.
Here.
Okay. Mr. Zillow.
Here.
Mr. Bernheim.
Present.
Mr. President, we have a quorum. Maybe I'll get used to doing that again.
Yeah, very good. All right. So the first, we have really one item that's on our agenda for this evening in connection with the enforcement of our bamboo ordinance. But before we get directly to that, this is an opportunity for the public to address the board if they wish to on the matter which is before us this evening. And if there is anybody that wishes to address, we don't have the public present here, they're still in Zoom world, please indicate and we will give you that opportunity. Mr. Van Louvenet, I understand you wish to address the board, so if you could then unmute yourself and introduce yourself, that would be fine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bernheim. I represent Mr. and Mrs. Lewis, the property owners at 351 Woodley, who were the folks who were cited with the violation notice that's the subject of the action before you tonight. I don't know how much background you have, and I don't know whether you prefer that I speak now or after there's some further introduction. But between the time this matter was on your agenda 2 weeks ago and tonight, Mr. High and I continue to work toward a settlement agreement that I believe accomplishes the objectives of the bamboo ordinance, perhaps better than strict compliance would accomplish those objectives given the specific circumstances of this situation. What we worked from is a plan prepared by John Kohler of Chester County Bamboo that was given to Mr. and Mrs. Lewis on May 17th. I shared it with Mr. High. We worked toward an agreement that I think, well, Gil can speak for himself, but which I think fairly deals with the situation that is at hand. My clients, although they were very reluctant to do this, agreed in that agreement to remove all the bamboo from their property. They agreed to follow Mr. Kohler's directive to cut it down to the ground, to monitor and remove any shoots that appeared, to continue that process for 3 to 4 years, which Mr. Kohler says in his experience does eliminate the growth of bamboo on a property, and that by doing so, they will have achieved what we believe to be the objective of the township ordinance. I think everyone who's looked at the situation agrees that in a situation where you have bamboo growing at or near a property boundary, constructing a barrier 3 feet deep, 20 feet back onto the property is not going to prevent the migration of bamboo. In this case, the only migration that it might prevent would be migration further on to my client's property, not to the adjoining property. Mr. Kohler had given us the opinion that implementation of his plan would, in his opinion, bring the Lewis property into compliance with the requirements of the township ordinance. Although it's by a different way, it's by a way which he described as being more effective than trying to comply in accordance with the ordinance, which, strictly speaking, would require excavation of the property boundary, removal of mature trees, and accomplish a number of other things which are not within the scope of the ordinance or within the intent. That agreement we memorialized by continuing discussions up toward the end of last week. My clients have signed the agreement. We presented it to the township and are frankly hoping that the commissioners will accept that as a compromise settlement. I went back and reviewed the findings of fact and conclusions and recommendations of the Bamboo Committee in its decision. And I was struck by the last sentence that begins on page 8, which reads, "Thus should the enforcement process commenced by either the township or the neighbors lead to a resolution not in strict conformity with the ordinance, maintenance of the bamboo on the Lewis property to prevent or severely restrict the potential for canes to extend over the neighboring property should be required." I respectfully suggest that the agreement that we have offered you achieves that objective. And I think if you follow Mr. Kohler's testimony, he would probably tell you that it accomplishes it better than your ordinance would permit you to accomplish it. It's a way of resolving this matter short of further litigation. If it's not resolved, my instructions are to proceed. It's not what the Lewises want to do, but they've lived in this township for 27 years. They had bamboo on their property, a significant growth of bamboo on their property when they acquired it 27 years ago. They haven't done anything different. They don't know who planted it. They know it was there when they were there. They believe that there was, and have testified that there was bamboo on the adjoining property now owned by Mr. and Mrs. Kosadak when they moved in. That was confirmed by Paul Lewis in discussions with his neighbor, who's now confined to a nursing home. And Mr. Kohler also offered the opinion that the bamboo was already on the Kosadak property when they acquired it. I'm not trying to get into the findings, but I want to just suggest to you that this was a complicated factual matter. Not everyone agrees, but what I do think is clear is that the objectives of your ordinance are furthered by the bamboo settlement agreement, in which my clients not only say they're going to proceed for 3 or 4 years in accordance with under Mr. Kohler's direction to eliminate the bamboo by natural selection. They also have agreed, and this was one of Mr. High's requests, that they continue to agree to remove bamboo beyond that period of time, regardless of whether it migrates to their property from adjoining properties or originates on their own property. I think, frankly, that goes beyond what your ordinance would have any property owner obligated to do. That's all I want to offer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Van Leuven. Is there anybody else, Jody, who was there for public comment? All right. With that, what we're going to do is the following. And Mr. Van Leuven, I am going to address some of your comments, but procedurally, what I'm going to do is move for the adoption of a resolution which accepts the findings and discussion and order of the panel, which was appointed by the Building and Planning Committee to hear the appeal in connection with the matter on 351 Woodley Road, Marion Station, for a violation notice issued for maintaining bamboo on their property within 20 feet of the common property line and for allowing bamboo to encroach on their neighbor's property. Do I have a second for that motion? Thank you, Commissioner Kramer and Commissioner McComb, who I will note were the other two panel members, along with myself, that heard the full hearing. With that, let me just make a comment. The board is extremely familiar with the factual background. I believe, if I am not mistaken, it's the third time this matter has been on our agenda. So the board has seen most of the materials that were submitted in connection with the hearing, as well as the findings and discussion and order, which is now proposed to be adopted in a resolution. The board has also seen the proposed agreement and encourages that the Lewises continue to communicate with the township. There are certain aspects of the agreement that the board cannot and will not accept. We're not going to negotiate those terms here, but let me just, for the purposes of the Lewises and Mr. Van Louvenet to respond to some of your comments, point out that the concept that the township would consider, and we need to all have this in writing before anything is finalized, is that there is acceptance of the findings in the order and that the township would forbear upon executing on it. The current agreement seeks to reserve all rights and then potential other litigation, and none of us want that. The bamboo ordinance is not designed to create litigation, but really to try to remedy a problem and hopefully amicably amongst neighbors in the township. In addition to that, the natural exhaustion procedure, which is outlined in the agreement, township's willing to afford the opportunity to go ahead and do that with certain constraints to it. And we certainly appreciate the Lewis's attempt and their expert to educate us on a different methodology than that which has been set forth within our code. Whether it works or not is still a question mark. All of us do research out there and we find things in favor of it, others which are not. So therefore we need a safety net, which we didn't find the current draft agreement adequately we provided. So without getting into those further details, I just want to encourage Mr. Van Louvenet, you and your clients to continue to communicate with the township and to do so promptly. But I am going to move forward unless there's any other discussion amongst my colleagues in connection with adopting the resolution, which acknowledges and accepts the findings of the panel and the order that it has prescribed. Any other discussions among any of my colleagues? Seeing none, I will then call the vote. All of those who are in favor, please raise your hands. We're still in Zoom world for that, indicating aye. Any opposed, raise your hands. Seeing none, it then does pass 12-0. That actually completes the official business for our special board meeting, which I will adjourn in a second, but just again, emphasize to Lewis's and Mr. Van Louvenet, please, continue your discussions with the township. With that, we will then turn to our Building and Planning Committee and recognize its co-chair, Commissioner Sinai.
Thank you, President Bernheim. So there is one item on our agenda for tonight, which is just a discussion item for the Subdivision and Land Development Ordinance, or commonly known as SALDO. So the way this is going to work tonight is that the team from Building and Planning is going to present a fair amount of material. This is the beginning of a process of updating our SALDO. This is a lengthy and involved process. It is akin to the zoning code, part B. A lot of key elements are in it. I'm grateful for staff for doing a tremendous amount of work and providing us with a rather thorough briefing. So staff will present, and at the end of it, we will have one round of commissioner questions and comments. And we're just going to do one round because we're at the stage where really we should be doing very high level kinds of comments or guidance for staff. I'm going to encourage my colleagues that if you have detailed comments or questions about details, those are at this stage best suited for email and not, we don't need to get them in at this stage of the process. But I'll come back to that at the end. And so at this point, we'll just turn over to our Director of Building and Planning, who is Chris Lesser.
Thank you, Commissioner Sinai. Really happy to be here tonight and having a chance to talk about the update to the Subdivision and Land Development Code when we're not pressed for time. We've been working with the township manager to try to find a time that we could give an update to the board on the subdivision code when we didn't have to share it with a lot of other things on the agenda and unfortunately, compromise the ability to take some time with this. So as Commissioner Sinai had mentioned, This is the update to the Subdivision and Land Development Code. The Subdivision and Land Development Code is a complementary code to the zoning code. They work somewhat in tandem. After the new zoning code was adopted last February, took staff a little bit of time due to the pandemic, due to a lot of the land development coming in, for everybody getting all their applications in before the old zoning code went away, to finally start this project. And we started at the end of last year, and the staff has been working with Montgomery County Planning Commission tremendously, spending an awful lot of time on this project. And in some ways, we were like, could we update this code in 6 months? And we could have updated the old code in 6 months and been able to address the old issues that were facing the township. Well, now the township's facing an entirely new set of growth patterns. These patterns have been established by the comprehensive plan in our new zoning code. So what we have done is we've pretty much blown up the old subdivision land development code. We're taking it to a whole new place. And I think tonight we're actually very excited to present where we want to take that new code to you. We're looking for some policy direction. We're not asking for votes, but we're going to be reading the room. We're going to be looking for consensus. This new code will contain significantly new chapters. We will be addressing entirely new elements of land development that were never really considered before. A lot of those elements, electric vehicles, greening, have been negotiated. They were things that the township's good at negotiating, but when you're really a good township, you should have it in your codes. So what we want to do is really codify all of these ideas and desires that came out of our comprehensive plan process. So let me just kind of take you through a little bit of an introduction tonight, and then I'm going to turn it over to Carissa Hazelton. Chris is a planner, has been with the township for over 10 years. You don't get to ordinarily see Carissa because she doesn't do a lot with land development. Carissa has been instrumental in updating the township's comprehensive plan and zoning ordinance. And she's really been the project manager on this and done a tremendous job working with the entire staff, working with the county, pulling this all together. And I just wanted to give credit to all the different people that are involved in this. This really is a complete staff effort. All of our different planners have been working on this. Greg Pritchard is a historic preservation planner, has done a lot of the graphics. He has a lot of skills beyond just the historic preservation. We've involved the township engineer to help us with some of the transportation issues, which are really a fundamental part of this. And then we've also been very fortunate to work with what I think are three of the best planners in Montgomery County, Marley Bice, Eric Jarrell, and Tamara Netiv, who are just fabulous to work with. So this is really a team effort as we go forward. So what is the subdivision code? We refer to the Subdivision Land Development Code somewhat as by its initials, the SALDO. And the Subdivision and Land Development Code is the qualitative elements of our land development code. It only applies to projects that are going through land development. It doesn't apply to projects that are going through permits. So when a project comes in for land development and project that goes through land development is more than a single family house. It's 2 or more units that are being developed, commercial development, institutional development. When that comes forward, the Subdivision and Land Development Code contains all of the plan processing requirements, how many plans somebody's supposed to submit, when they're supposed to submit it. There are rules that are established by the Pennsylvania enabling legislation that give applicants rights to work through the municipal approval process. And that's really the guts of what a Subdivision and Land Development Code says. It says somebody has a right to develop their property. Here are the minimum requirements that need to be done. Well, the enabling legislation also allows communities to add things to their Subdivision and Land Development Code other than just processing an application. It allows community to add qualitative elements. And over the years, the township has done that primarily to preserve trees. A lot of our existing subdivision code refers to greening. The picture that I've included in this presentation tonight shows Penn Valley Gladwin back in 1937. And the subdivision code said, you can go develop this area, try to preserve some of the trees that are here. And you can see back in the day, a lot of this area was very much open. We have new challenges. Our new code will address not necessarily preserving trees. We're going to do that with this. But in many of the areas where growth is going to occur in the township are parking lots. They're old shopping centers. They're car dealerships. They're downtown areas. Well, those areas, we want to add trees. We want to manufacture open space. the subdivision code will be adjusted to be able to do that. So we're really taking this and adding many of these new things to the subdivision code that many other communities, I think you'll see from the audit that staff has done, haven't done yet. We're going to try to push the envelope as far as we can. This effort is firmly based on implementing the principles and challenges outlined in the comprehensive plan. For 5 years, 7 years, we've been doing a series, the staff has been doing these public outreach meetings about all of the updating the land development code. And we've kept very good notes. And at many times, it's been very frustrating for people saying, when are you going to include this? When are you going to include that? I kept saying, well, that's for the subdivision and land development code. It's not really a zoning issue yet. It's not really a planning issue. Well, tonight we start to get into some of those issues. And it really, when we did the comprehensive plan, we kept those notes and we have those recommendations, and you'll see we'll refer to those, that really set the program for what we wanted to do. This SALDO will respond to new development. We're not planning for what happened in the past, we're planning for what's happening in the future. The challenge of this community is making sure that redevelopment of our commercial areas, which is primarily where our land development is going to occur in the past. These cornfield developments, these greenfield developments that are shown in this picture are really a thing in the past. The vast majority of estates in the township have already been developed. There will be very few residential subdivisions going forward. You'll see maybe 1, 2 a year into the future. You're not going to see tract homes with 20 houses or so. Our subdivision code is really set up for that, our old subdivision code, our existing subdivision. The new subdivision code is going to be really oriented what's happening at City Avenue, what's happening along Lancaster Avenue corridor, what's happening in those commercial areas. It's going to have things for connectivity, for bicycling, for walking, for trees, all of those different elements that are facing us into the future, because we want to make sure that Lower Merion has the highest quality development going forward. And we want to make sure that we have those standards in place and we don't have to negotiate. As I mentioned earlier, the SALDO complements the zoning code. The zoning code says what, where, and how you can build. It applies to many different elements. Applies to every property. The subdivision land development code only applies to properties going through land development, but it really does add those qualitative elements that really make a project better. There are things that really we say this is what makes Lower Merion a nice place, and that's what we really want to enforce. It's different from the Natural Features Code. The Natural Features Code also applies for permits. And so it applies if somebody's doing some work on their own property, like a grading permit, for instance. Somebody's putting in a new pool, somebody's adding an expansion to their house. The Natural Features Code will apply to that. This code does not apply to this. This is only to new land development. And then finally, the land development, this effort will really work with all of those other elements that are coming forward. Right now, staff is working with various commissioners and ad hoc committees on affordable housing. We're working on new sidewalks. We're working on new bikeways. We're working on greening. We're working on sustainability. This code is not waiting for that to be done. It's really trying to coordinate all of those efforts together. Back in 1937, we had a great subdivision code that was developed by our planning commission. It was wonderful for developing real estate. Over the course of time, as that real estate became more and more valuable and we became more and more developed, open space became something that's very important. And the reason I included this picture of Linwood Park, that was a choice that we made about 10 years ago, that there was a parking lot that could have been developed for 6 houses. And the township, and working through the community, decided to make it a park. That park's become a real key part of that neighborhood. We want to do this for City Avenue. We want to do this for Ardmore. We want to do this for all of our community spaces. Imagine those qualitative elements of Linwood Park in those spaces. These are the kind of things that the new code will do to really address those future land development challenges. Key piece of this is transportation. When you look at our existing codes, they rely on an official highway map. This official highway map is about moving cars as fast as you can from point A to point B. And in many cases, that's okay, unless you're trying to ride a bike or you're trying to walk. What we've heard now in the last 10 years is people do want to walk. People do want to ride their bike. We're looking to move from, official highway map that just prioritizes cars at the expense of all other modes of transportation towards a more complete streets idea that makes roads safe and it makes them convenient for a variety of different mobilities and people of all sorts of ages. This is a community. We want everybody to be comfortable and to be safe, and we want to be smart. And this is that sort of planning that goes into this. So when new development comes in, we have these standards on. Developers develop to their road. They develop up to the edge of their parcel. When we can get these improvements, this will help to make those improvements that the township doesn't have to pay for over time. When we adopted the zoning code, we were very proud of a number of the different things that it accomplished. We reduced residential subdivisions. We created standards for our commercial areas, and we had all these. The new zoning code, and when Carissa finishes her presentation, will take this sort of list, and she'll have this sort of list that the new subdivision land development code will outline. With that, I'm going to log off. I'm going to let Carissa share her screen, and she's going to take you through the process and the background, and then all of the challenges that the new subdivision and land development code has. We'll be looking for at the end the direction from the board on some of these various things that she's raised. So thank you.
All right, Chris, thank you very much for that introduction and for getting the discussion started tonight. So with regards to the process and where we're at with the development of the new subdivision land development code, we started with a review of all of the base documents, including the comprehensive plan and the issues report, as well as looking at the new zoning code and how that relates to the provisions in the subdivision land development code. And also then doing an analysis of the current provisions. We looked at other communities to pull best practices from other areas. We conducted a survey of local practitioners in the community to find out what works well in the subdivision land development code and what can be improved. And we also did an audit of recently approved land development applications. And finally, we're at the point where we're updating the subdivision land development code to include some of the recommendations and the findings from that initial analysis and audit that was conducted. In terms of the project schedule, the project is divided into 4 basic phases: the assessment and analysis, the drafting of the new subdivision land development code regulations, the adoption process, and then finally implementation. As you can see from the chart, right now, we have completed phase 1, the assessment and analysis. In November, we had the project startup. We reviewed the best practices and organization of the code. We conducted the audit and analysis of the subdivision and land development code and prepared the assessment and analysis findings. We provided a complete document that was included as a part of tonight's packet with the agenda. I believe the final assessment, audit and assessment report was over 100, close to 120 pages. So this process for phase 1 has taken place from November until tonight, with the presentation of these findings being the milestone for us to hit. We're moving into drafting of the new subdivision land development code. As you can see, we've already started some of the initial phases, some of the initial work, but we do need to get some feedback and policy direction from the board with regards to some of the new elements that we'd like to consider including in the new subdivision land development code. So first, we'll just go over the subdivision and land development code assessment and the tasks that were included in phase 1. So we started with the best practices, and we looked at other communities nationwide that had incorporated form-based zoning because we wanted to include the best and newest ideas with regards to form-based zoning and the code that we had just adopted in 2020 of last year, or in February of last year. So with the best practices, we identified areas of improvement and elements that are missing from our subdivision land development code. We then conducted the land development case studies and identified sections of the code that work well and those that don't work as well. We then conducted the survey and compiled the survey results. We reached out to over 100 practitioners, and some of the areas that we realized we need improvement are the ease of use for the Subdivision Land Development Code, and really synthesizing the provisions of the Subdivision Land Development Code with other elements or with other chapters of the Township Code. We looked at the comprehensive plan recommendations, and we wanted to make sure that any new standards align with the vision and recommendations from the comprehensive plan. And we also looked at recommendations from other plans to identify standards to be revised and improved. So with the best practices, for an overview, we reviewed adopted subdivision and land development ordinances that were relevant, that were in relevant communities to identify elements that could be included in our subdivision land development code, and considered whether including those elements would work for us and if they were consistent with the recommendations of the comprehensive plan. We reviewed the applicable standards to understand if and how they ensured the desired result, and then we considered the implications for implementing the standards in our community. So like I said, we took a look at other communities nationwide, but we really honed in on local examples here in the state of Pennsylvania. As you know, the enabling legislation for the Subdivision Land Development Code is the Pennsylvania Municipalities Planning Code. And it's very, state specific. So these standards would be able to be implemented here in Lower Merion Township without any possible hiccups, that we might find in comparing ourselves to communities from other states. So we highlighted some findings from Liddittsboro. We also saw that Penn Township and Lancaster County had included some recent form-based code elements in their subdivision land development code. West Whiteland Township, Upper Dublin Township, and Penn Township in Chester County. So with Liddittsboro in Lancaster County, they adopted their subdivision land development code in February of 2010. And some of the form-based elements of their subdivision code included public street frontage requirements, where they had standards specific to their curbs, their tree lawn, their sidewalk, and their front lawn. We're really talking about that, public realm before you hit the private space and of the building itself. They also had architectural standards for traditional neighborhood developments and lighting fixture standards. So we took a look at how the standards were applied in recent developments. And in one example at the Wilbur in Lidditz, they provided really great streetscape standards. At the Warwick Woodlands, they had great lighting fixture standards and public street frontage standards that really helped to enhance that sense of place. Their architectural design guidelines were written in more of a general way. And photographs were used to display desirable design standards. One of the things coming forward with the Subdivision Land Development Code is that we would like to have a graphic document with great illustrations to make it easy for the average user to see and understand exactly what it is that the standards are laying out. Another example that we looked at was the Greater Fort Washington District in Upper Dublin, Pennsylvania. And this subdivision code was adopted in 2019. The guidelines include pedestrian connectivity, streetscape standards, landscape standards, green space, and public gathering space. They also included stormwater parking, alternative transportation, and enhanced architectural standards, including street furniture and signage elements. The Subdivision Land Development Code for the Greater Fort Washington District really aims for a Main Street character. The architectural guidelines are written to also in a general way and are less prescriptive. And there are several general standards, particularly one with regards to last mile transit, where it says that last mile transit multi-use trail linkages to pedestrian and or trail networks, and the proposed cross-county trail shall be provided to the maximum extent feasible. So some of the key takeaways in looking at all of these different communities and what their subdivision land development codes incorporated were that the form-based provisions should really do complement the zoning code that was adopted by the township, with a focus on the public realm and the relationship between the building and the street. The streetscape standards are very important, with provisions established for the street trees, the landscape verge, and the incorporation of civic space. We also felt that a lot of the communities advanced a complete streets approach, where they provided standards for all modes of travel. And the architectural standards were not overly specific, and they provided direction for the developer, but they weren't overly regulated, which allows for some creativity in design. And finally, the best examples that we saw had clear text and illustrations that really demonstrated the standards. So once we wrapped up the best practices and the review of other communities, we moved on to land development case studies here in Lower Merion Township. 12 different sites were selected, and they're geographically distributed, and they provide for a mix of uses. An example of one case study that was completed was 225 East Montgomery Avenue in Ardmore, where we reviewed a recent land development application that required a waiver from the Natural Features Code to disturb steep slopes over 25%. One of the key things that we found in this case study and many others were that when we looked at the buffer standards between uses, that a lot of times we were getting a single line of arborvitae to provide for a buffer, which is one of the areas that we recognize now we want to enhance as we move forward and revise the subdivision land development code. The summary charts showed key code deviations and identified sections of the land development code that were commonly referred to and scrutinized at a higher level. The next step was to move on to the subdivision and land development code survey. So as I indicated earlier, we reached out to over 100 practitioners in the community, and we did receive over 25 responses. The purpose was to obtain feedback from those who use the subdivision and land development code regularly, to identify the areas of the code that work well and those areas that really needed to be improved. So the key results from the survey that we conducted were that we need to improve the consistency between other chapters of the township code. We also learned that a lot of the practitioners would prefer a performance-based landscaping standards over having strict numerical standards that can be adhered to. And then finally, some of the responses indicated that some of the design standards should be moved to the zoning code, or to the subdivision land development code from the zoning code, such as public gathering space is one example. As we mentioned earlier, we also took a look at the comprehensive plan recommendations. The new comprehensive plan was adopted in 2016. It was implemented with the new zoning code that was adopted in 2020. And the next step is to continue with our momentum and roll that into the new subdivision land development code. So it's important to keep an eye on the vision from the comprehensive plan to preserve Lower Merion's classic residential neighborhoods, including the township's institutions, parks, and natural environment, and reinvest in the township's village cores and commercial areas to improve walkability, expand transit use, and encourage design excellence. With an eye towards our vision, all of the provisions for the Subdivision Land Development Code will fall into place. A key recommendation from the comprehensive plan was to update the Subdivision Land Development Code to better address infill and retrofit challenges. Key recommendations that we'll be coming forward with from the circulation element include taking a complete streets approach to ensure that all modes of travel can be accommodated, to promote walking and biking as equal modes of transportation for local trips within the township to improve public health, to also incorporate context-sensitive streetscape design standards, and to ensure that passenger amenities are provided at bus and rail transportation facilities to make this mode of transportation more attractive. From the water resources element, we'll be assessing and amending the township code as needed to improve stormwater management on existing new and redeveloped parking lots. And from the community facilities element, there was a key recommendation was to ensure the effective implementation of the recreation provision to establish and maintain meaningful recreation facilities. So the Subdivision Land Development Code currently does require a set aside for recreational land when a project involving more than 3 residential units is constructed. And we want to ensure that we continue to review and refine that section of the code to make sure that we are getting meaningful recreational spaces and civic spaces for our new residents as they move into the community, and to also serve the existing residents. So while we were undertaking phase 1 with the audit and assessment of the local Subdivision Land Development Code, we were contacted by the Pennsylvania Environmental Council and informed that they did receive a grant that they had submitted for back in 2019, and the township had signed on and signed a letter of support. And as a part of their project, they will conduct a third-party independent review of all of the township's codes to identify policy barriers to green stormwater infrastructure implementation. So a goal of this project was to improve water quality through increased implementation of green stormwater management practices. And what the Pennsylvania Environmental Council is doing is conducting an in-depth audit of Lower Merion's ordinances to identify codes and policies presenting the largest barriers to green stormwater infrastructure implementation. So this screen shows a snapshot of what the audit tool looks like that they'll be using. They identify the barriers, provide tips, include code references and language from the code, and then they recommend notes, or they recommend ideas and provide some strategies to advance green stormwater infrastructure. So the timing of this project and their independent audit works extremely well with the Subdivision Land Development Code preparation. In April, they began the data collection and community scoping. And right now they're in the process of conducting their audit from May till June. The next step is to prioritize recommended actions and then to have some follow through. So they did expedite the review of the Subdivision Land Development Code for the purpose of the meeting tonight. And there are 5 key recommendations coming from the Pennsylvania Environmental Council. One is to include green stormwater infrastructure and GSI practice definitions into the Subdivision Land Development Code and to cross-reference with zoning and stormwater codes. The second is notes that sketch plan The tentative sketch plan requires identification of areas to be set aside for stormwater management for projects exceeding 8 lots or 5 acres, or for non-residential development. And they recommend considering lowering the threshold to include this requirement in smaller properties. The third recommendation is to update the code to provide allowances for stormwater management measures and related features in planted buffer areas such as deciduous trees, shrubs, and wildlife habitat and food. The fourth is to evaluate requirements for street widths, sidewalk curbs, and cul-de-sac minimum right-of-way and paving widths for potential to accommodate green stormwater infrastructure, such as bioswales, tree trenches, and landscaped islands. And then finally, with operation and maintenance, they recommend that the responsibility for the continued maintenance and operation of stormwater management facilities shall be the obligation of the property owner or the township as applicable. The addition of stormwater management facilities in the street right-of-way will require provisions in the code for assigning operation and maintenance responsibilities to the property owner. So that got us through the initial audit and analysis of our existing subdivision land development code. And taking everything that we learned, staff began to really pull out the key code recommendations. And this is where we will be asking for some policy direction. So I believe Todd may have mentioned that we'll go through the presentation first, and then we'll ask some questions. And I believe there are 6 key areas where we're requesting some policy direction. So one of the key recommendations was to organize the code and make sure that it is easy to use. We will be incorporating innovative planning tools and form-based elements and synthesizing the new code with other chapters of the code, of the township code, including aligning the subdivision land development code with the new zoning code. In terms of organization, we plan to organize the subdivision land development code into 11 articles, and we're following the subdivision and land development model ordinance that was put together by Montgomery County. Article 1 is general provisions, followed by definitions. Article 3 includes plan filing, processing, and review. Article 4 includes design standards. Article 5 includes landscape standards. Article 6 includes mobile home park standards, which is a requirement of the MPC. Article 7 includes improvement construction requirements. Article 8 includes special studies and reports. Article 9 includes administration, fees, and enforcement. Article 10 includes amendments, validity, and a repealer. And then finally, Article 11 will include our traffic impact fee provisions. So in terms of key recommendations, the first one that we want to hit on is the complete streets recommendation. We really want to take a look at the roads from a whole new level where we're integrating walking, biking, and the vehicles, and really designing dimensional standards for multimodal streets. In this section, we do plan on providing some graphic illustrations and cross-references and cross-sections for each street classification. Next, we'll move on to the context-sensitive streetscape design for non-residential development, where we'll focus on main street focus areas that are identified in the comprehensive plan. The specific locations include the Village Center and Town Center districts along Lancaster Avenue, Montgomery Avenue, and up in Gladwin. The streetscape design guidelines could be modified for each street, for each context, where we may be able to make changes that are site specific or context specific. Next, we have the context sensitive streetscape designs for residential developments on arterial roads, where the specific residential streetscape standards will leverage the existing infrastructure and will focus on walkable neighborhoods near schools, transit, and commercial districts. The next, when we look at transportation, another key recommendation is to look at street trees and the soil volume standards. I know Chris had mentioned at the beginning that we've been hearing from different parties, that there are areas of our code that we need to improve. And we've been asked, when are we going to get to that? And with the Shade Tree Commission, they've been very patient with us. We're finally at the point where we can integrate some soil volume standards to make sure that the street trees that are planted in the right of way are successful and viable in the long term. So, street trees provide several benefits to the community by softening and beautifying roadway corridors and creating a canopy to mitigate heat impacts of pavement and provide shading, and they improve pedestrian safety. Our current subdivision land development code requires that shade trees be located on both sides of the street, 30 feet on center. One thing that our code lacks is, soil volume and structural soil standards. This type of standards decreases the biotic stresses of urban street trees by allowing for root growth and aeration of the root zone. They reduce soil compaction and improve the long-term viability of street trees. Here we have some examples of different illustrations that we may include with these new standards. Next up is another key recommendation to incorporate transportation demand management standards into the subdivision land development code. Transportation demand management is a strategy used to inform and encourage travelers to maximize the efficiency of a transportation system, leading to improved mobility, reduced congestion, and lower vehicle emissions. So in June of 2020, just 1 year ago, Lower Merion Township adopted the first TDM policy in the region. At the time, a TDM ordinance was drafted and it was delayed due to the impacts of COVID-19. The TDM plan requirements include providing for carpool and van pool preferential parking designation, bicycle parking facilities and site designation, commuter matching services, and transportation information displays, ride sharing promotional materials, and updated bicycle route and trail maps. So one question that we have for the board is, as we draft these standards, if they would prefer that an applicant or a developer be required to submit a TDM plan when a project hits a certain threshold, which could be either based on size or number of employees, or if it should be incentivized. The draft ordinance had included a parking reduction in exchange for a developer providing a TDM plan and following a TDM plan to ensure that to encourage multimodal transportation of its employees. Next up, we have bus stop design guidelines that we would like to incorporate into the new subdivision land development code. This image came from the Philadelphia Inquirer this past year, and it is a bus stop here in Lower Merion at Hollow Road and Conshohocken State Road in Lower Merion. The township does have a number of lines that run through it, serving thousands of customers a day. And we can do more to improve the way that our bus stops, look and function. Here we have an image of the City Avenue district and a recently installed bus shelter at the Ballackinwood Shopping Center right by the Bryn Mawr Trust building, which has a nice shelter and a sitting wall and a trash can in front of it. And it helps to advance the recommendation from the comprehensive plan to ensure that passenger amenities are provided at bus and rail transportation facilities. We would like to establish bus stop design guidelines to provide consistency and continuity, and to ensure the installation of attractive amenities at bus stops along Lower Merion roadways. This is an opportunity for the township to really, highlight some of its best attributes, and having a high quality bus shelter would help to do that. We look to incorporate SEPTA's bus stop design guidelines. And, one area of note is that transit facility improvements are incentivized in the City Avenue District with a floor area ratio increase, and they're negotiated elsewhere, which will require maintenance agreements with developers at the time of installation. And this is something that we could, provide some better guidance on in the Subdivision Land Development Code. Next up, we have the electric vehicle standards. And again, this is a really exciting concept that our EAC has been advocating for a very long time. The new zoning code does include a definition for electric vehicles, but there's very little regulation. We've reserved the requirement for electric vehicle parking in the zoning code. Aside from having the definitions and prohibiting electric vehicle charging station structures in frontage yards, we haven't gone much farther than that. We do see this as an opportunity to incorporate some standards for the layout and design of these facilities in the Subdivision Land Development Code. So there are many trends to include the incorporation for single family units with the driveway, multifamily dwellings, and commercial developments. Requirements are based on the specific use and number of parking spaces. One thing to consider is that the Subdivision Land Development Code would only capture a single family when it comes in as a part of a subdivision. And we're actually considering a potential amendment to the building code, which would be amended independently. The Subdivision Land Development Code provisions would be applicable to new multifamily mixed use and commercial development. Although there are some challenges with multifamily developments, such as less charging feasibility for these rental units, unless there are dedicated parking spaces and building owners committed to upgrade. And there are challenges for commercial facilities as well. We do recommend establishing standards in the Subdivision Land Development Code. Research indicates that at least 26 state or local jurisdictions have enacted some form of electric vehicle readiness corresponding to one of the three following formats. There's EV readiness, which is referred to the installation of electric vehicle infrastructure at the time of construction for the purpose of minimizing cost and effort of installation of a charger. EV ready is a term describing an infrastructure installation, which includes a surface termination box into which a charger would be attached. And then EV capable is a third term or third format, which means an installation which stops short of the surface termination box. So from looking at what other communities have done, the Lower Merion ordinance would mainly focus on EV ready requirement, which is a combination of a percentage of electric vehicle ready and electric vehicle capable formats, which may be more desirable based on use. So another key recommendation is to incorporate green parking lot standards. This is another area where we've worked with the EAC for many years on this, and we feel that bringing this forward with the Subdivision Land Development Code is a good time. One thing to be aware of is that there is a lot of interplay between the Natural Features Code and the Subdivision Land Development Code as it relates to landscape standards and specifically green parking lot standards. It could be that as we move forward, that the natural features code may be the best place to house the green parking lot standards, specifically because you can incorporate green parking lot standards on a lot by lot basis when it's not a part of a land development plan, if it's in the natural features code, as opposed to if it's in the subdivision land development code, those would only be incorporated at the time of the land development application. There are many benefits to green parking lots. They minimize the heat island effect by maximizing shading and greening. They promote infiltration and naturalized drainage to protect local water quality. They integrate the built and natural environment and built environment effectively, and they provide safe passage and walkways for pedestrians and parking lots. Potential changes in the code include lowering the threshold for applicability from 15,000 square feet to 8,000 square feet or 20 or more parking spaces. We're also looking to refine the perimeter parking area standards with an integrated application of the green parking lot ordinance elements. The parking lot perimeter could also require more canopy trees and the installation of bioretention, such as bioswales or rain gardens. And it could also establish planting densities in the bioretention areas. And we looked, for local examples to see what's working in other communities. And Cheltenham Township has a new subdivision land development code that we had looked at that specifies a percentage of the vehicular use area that must be landscaped based on the total vehicular use on the site. Other potential changes include with the redevelopment of existing parking lots to establish a threshold for compliance when a building is expanded a certain percentage, then the parking lot would be retrofitted to current standards, and to establish plant selection diversity. Smart design elements to parking lot standards to improve pedestrian circulation and safety could be incorporated into the subdivision land development code. We could require clear dedicated pathways into the parking lot and direct connections to focal points. We could integrate other required design elements such as bike parking, electric vehicle charging stations, bus shelters, and other elements into the parking lot design. We could separate the pedestrian areas from the vehicles by landscape islands and medians for pedestrian walkways, and balance and integrate planted islands with pedestrian access. We could provide pavement striping, crosswalks, and pavement markings for pedestrians, and include traffic control and calming elements that can be incorporated with larger parking lots. We could also include dedicated pedestrian drop-off areas with building entry plazas, and consider pedestrian plaza areas to provide gathering spaces. Next up, when we talk about buffer planting, when we talk about landscaping, is buffer planting design. Buffer planting is a planning concept that is intended to mitigate visual and audible impact of higher intensity uses upon lower intensity uses. What we've seen is a lot of our buffer areas consist of a single row of arborvitae that technically conform to the code requirements, and we recognize that this is an area of the code that can be improved and should be improved as we revise the subdivision land development code and synthesize the standards between the zoning code, subdivision land development code, and the natural features code. This will advance the recommendation of the comprehensive plan that revised zoning should reflect existing commercial land use and provide appropriate controls for residential properties, such as appropriate buffers and design standards to ensure the orientation of commercial activities away from residences. So we did a lot of research and found that many local jurisdictions have enacted some form of buffer standards. We looked at 8 municipalities for standards and noted similar guidelines for prescribing buffers, which included performance-based standards for creating the buffer, a visual screen at maturity, buffer classes based on proximity to dissimilar or conflicting zoning uses, softening versus screening, a requirement for a variety of landscape materials to ensure biodiversity and species richness, and species variety that informs the buffer planting health. Next up, we took a look at our greening standards. The greening standards are intended to create a balanced, ordered street with regular and consistent placement of street elements in commercial districts. Within this framework, there's room for a variety and flexibility while maintaining a cohesive character. The township added the greening standards to the Subdivision Land Development Code in 2005. They currently apply to the town center, village center, Bryn Mawr Village District, Rock Hill Road, and City Avenue districts. The Bryn Mawr Village District allows for an impervious increase from 70% to 100% with compliance of the greening standards. The greening standards are based on linear feet of frontage in the category of building, addition, new building, and district. And points are required from different categories. The way that the code is set up, it's intended to provide kind of a menu for a developer to pick from. If you look at the table in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, but one thing that we found when we conducted the SALDO survey was that practitioners are finding some of these standards a little confusing, and this is an area where we can improve the standards that we have in the code. So some of the recommendations from the comprehensive plan included incorporating streetscape standards into the revised zoning, promoting street trees, commercial greening, and landscape setbacks, and to promote a higher level of public greening in traditional Main Street areas. Per the Subdivision Land Development Code survey and staff comment, the greening standards are a bit difficult to apply and can be redundant between public gathering space, street tree, and natural features requirements. The aim of the revisions will be to include guidelines for the development and placement of streetscape elements to create a safe, attractive, and functional public realm within the township's commercial areas. Next, we also took a look at the public gathering space. The public gathering space is provided for in the zoning code in the TC1 district, the City Avenue district, and the Bryn Mawr Village district. Public gathering space is private outdoor space where the public is directly or indirectly invited to visit or they're permitted to congregate. The public gathering space standards are currently incentivized where additional height is granted in the TC1 district, additional floor area is granted in the City Avenue district, and additional height is also granted in the Bryn Mawr Village district. The public gathering space standards themselves vary by district, but the City Avenue district has the most specific standards. A key recommendation is to pull those design standards from the zoning code into the Subdivision Land Development Code. This will provide for greater flexibility for infill development and allow for a developer to design to the existing conditions. It also allows us an opportunity to enhance the standards to ensure that the location and design of the public gathering space is integrated into the site design rather than being included as an afterthought. One of the recommendations from the comprehensive plan was to identify appropriate locations for permanent or seasonal civic space in all commercial areas and ensure that areas considered for public gathering space are appropriately landscaped. So when we look at the principles of the principles that will be applied in the Subdivision Land Development Code with the public gathering space standards, we would like the public gathering spaces to be open and inviting at the sidewalk. They should be easily seen and understood as open to the public. This will convey a sense of openness and maintain clear sight lines through the design elements and generous paths leading to the plaza. They should be accessible. They should be located at a similar elevation as a sidewalk, and they should be designed to enhance pedestrian circulation. They should also be safe and secure, containing easily accessible paths for ingress and egress, They should be oriented and visually connected to the street, and they should be well lit. They should also be comfortable and engaging. This will promote use and comfort by providing essential amenities to accommodate both small groups and individuals with a variety of well-designed, comfortable seating. This will also balance open areas with greenery and public trees. Another key element that we're looking at with the new subdivision land development code is the recreational land or fee in lieu. Right now, the subdivision land development code requires a set aside of 15% of the land area for recreation purposes or a fee in lieu of the land based on the number of units in the development. This is allowed by the Pennsylvania Municipalities Planning Code. Currently, the township has a fee in lieu of $3,000 per unit, and this code provision was initially adopted in 2006, and it was amended in 2017 and 2018. The funds are used to provide, acquire, operate, or maintain park or recreational facilities reasonably accessible to the development. There is an opportunity to expand the applicability, and this is where we're looking for some policy direction with really two key questions. One is whether the board is in favor of expanding the recreational land provisions to also apply to commercial and institutional development, and to also consider an option to increase the current fee in lieu on an annual or more regular basis. Right now, it's updated every few years. Next up, we have, we're looking to incorporate some standards with regards to the official map. So the official map is currently in Chapter 107 of the Township Code. The Board of Commissioners adopted the official map in 2012. There was one map for the City Avenue District and one map for the official highway map. Both maps were taken to the Montgomery County Recorder of Deeds and put on file. The City Avenue District official map shows the location of public gathering space, linear public gathering space, open space, new minor roads, and public multi-purpose paths. It also shows potential trail connections. The official highway map shows the location of existing and proposed streets, and this is the official highway map that the township has had in place for several years. An official map is a planning tool authorized by the Pennsylvania Municipalities Planning Code and serves as notice of reservation of land for future public use. The official declaration of the township's interest in it is an official declaration of the township's interest in providing these lands for streets, parks, open spaces, trails, transit routes, and other public purposes. Official maps are not to be confused with a municipal base map or street map or zoning map. It is its own unique planning tool. So how does it work? It allows an opportunity for the township to acquire property or rights thereto for a public use before development or redevelopment occurs and does not itself constitute a municipal taking of private property. How we've used the official map in the City Avenue District is that developers have been able to take advantage of different incentives in the zoning code for providing amenities that are shown on the official map. So we looked at a few other examples of municipalities that have used the official map. And one key policy question that we have for the board is whether we should expand the use of the official map beyond the City Avenue District to show at the desired location of future civic amenities in other locations in the township. The examples we looked at did provide locations for future public amenities kind of throughout the entire community. And on this screen, we're showing an example of the borough of Chambersburg and the official map of Chestnut Hill Township, which uses the official map to reserve lands for road and intersection upgrades for improved safety and traffic flow at multiple locations in the township, and to identify conservation lands of high priority for preservation. So next up, we have the impact study requirements. This is another key policy question that we have for the Board of Commissioners. Currently, the Subdivision Land Development Code does require a traffic impact study and an environmental impact statement. One question we have for the board is whether we should expand the use of, or whether we should expand the role of the Subdivision Land Development Code to require an economic or community facility impact study. The land use element of the comprehensive plan includes several significant general recommendations to revise the township zoning and land development codes to better address the impacts of infill and redevelopment on the established community fabric. An impact study provides a structured process for considering the implications for people and their environment of proposed actions while there's still an opportunity to modify the proposals. It is applied at all levels of decision-making, from policies to specific projects. Impact studies and assessments are intended as decision-making documents that, when written effectively, identify a cost-benefit analysis of proposed actions associated with land development. Impact assessments begin with a threshold for identifying the requirement to provide the analysis. For example, the square footage of development or the amount of impervious coverage from land disturbance or location within a specific district. The contents of impact assessment of an impact assessment report generally address the following steps. First, they prepare a research plan. Second, they contract and staff the impact assessment. Third, they carry out the field research and analyze its results. And finally, they disseminate the impact assessment findings. So when we look at the types of impact study requirements, as I indicated, the township currently does require a transportation or traffic impact study to determine the traffic generation or circulation patterns in new development. The two new ones that we're seeking policy direction on are the economic impact statement to estimate changes in employment, income, and levels of business activity, to consider a range of economic from changes in the composition of the regional economy, including impact on jobs, employee compensation, and sales that are attributable to new economic activities, programs, or events, and the economic impact statement also commonly relies on input-output software models to estimate multiplier effects. The community facilities impact study is one that we've gotten questions about in the past as land development proposals come forward, whether the township would consider requiring a community facility impact study. This type of study would assess the project costs and revenues likely to occur as a result of a development policy or program. And the primary interest is in substantial changes in population and or service demands on the township, county, and or school district. It seeks to connect planning and local economics by estimating the public costs and revenues resulting from property investments. And it helps to determine whether local government can meet new demands for services. So I think we are getting to the last recommended, the last element that's being recommended for inclusion in the Subdivision Land Development Code. And this is another policy question for the board, is considering an administrative review of minor improvements, or otherwise known as a de minimis plan process. We With the subdivision land development code, we would determine the appropriate threshold for a de minimis plan improvement. And this would be a minor improvement where a small commercial project, for example, under a certain size, say 1,000 square feet, could come through a de minimis plan as opposed to coming through as a waiver plan. And a building and or a grading permit would be required as long as zoning compliance is demonstrated and an engineering review is conducted. The de minimis plan process streamlines the approval process for smaller projects and allows the developer to, or the business owner to make minor modest improvements without triggering the full-blown land development process. And that got us through the key recommendations. We'll get to the next steps. And really, this is a snapshot of the project schedule. Once again, we are at the presentation of the final assessment and analysis findings, seeking board direction on some of the policy issues that have arisen. Over the course of the next several months, we'll be drafting the subdivision land development code standards and presenting a draft to the board this fall. One question that we do have for the board, and this is the final question of the evening, is with regards to the drafting of the new subdivision land development code, whether the board would like to essentially take a minor timeout to conduct some testing. We would work with the Montgomery County Planning Commission, similarly to the testing that was done for the zoning code in November of 2019, to make sure that the code is working well and to mitigate any potential issues before the code is adopted. So the Montgomery County Planning Commission is set forth this 8-week process. Phase 1 includes the site selection, which would be completed after the first subdivision land development code is drafted. So, or subdivision land development code is completed. So if we're coming forward to the board in October with the draft subdivision land development code, that would be the starting date of the testing. The county would select 8 to 10 sites with recent land development proposals under the new subdivision land development code and the new zoning code. And phase 2 would involve the actual testing. Initially, the Montgomery County Planning Commission staff would take 3 weeks and conduct internal testing of 3 to 5 sites with different characteristics and summarize the interim results. Phase 3 would involve external testing, which would take 3 weeks, and there would be 4 to 5 professionals comprised of engineers, architects, and planners that would conduct testing of additional sites of different characteristics. And then phase 4 would involve the wrap-up, which would take 2 weeks. And during this phase, the township and Montgomery County Planning Commission would host a joint meeting, either online or in person, for presentation and discussion of results. And the results would then be used to refine the subdivision and land development code prior to the adoption of the new code. So while the draft would be presented in October, we would take the next few months, and which would take us to January of 2020 with the draft subdivision land development code that would have been refined to address any anomalies that come up during the testing process, to then have the code ready for action by the board in January 2020. It does add 8 weeks to the project schedule. But, from staff's recommendation is that we've learned this has been well worth the time to undertake the testing, but we do need the board's direction on that item as well. So with that, I want to thank you for your patience. I know that was a long presentation, but I'd like to open it up to questions. And, like I said, I believe there are 6 policy items that we are seeking the board's direction on. Todd, I see that you're speaking, but I believe you're muted.
Yeah, we're
Does anyone else work?
I can hear you.
Carissa, can you hear anyone else?
What if we try
Okay.
using a mic from one of our computers?
Well,
Try it. Hey, look, I lived with that for months, as I recall.
so
Yeah, that's
nope.
reminiscent of what I went
It's like the
through.
Wizard of Oz. Maybe we cut up all that.
Todd, even though it's going to echo, why don't you, hold on a second, let me just try this.
I wonder if it went into
I
sleep.
can go to another room. So I can go into the conference room.
Hold on. What about now? Is anybody on the other end able to hear me? Carissa, can you hear me?
No, I'm getting text
Oh, wait a
messages
second,
from Holly
wait.
that they can't hear.
You gonna try that?
I think all of ours are on it. It's not picking up anyone.
You know, my mic always takes a while to warm
Yeah,
up.
so we're all on.
Wait a minute. Hold on.
Tell them to come upstairs.
All right.
Josh, do you have another mic?
Are you able to hear me at all?
Now I can.
All right, so there's an echo in here when I speak, but
And also
having
feedback.
technical difficulties, so bear with us, please.
Has this ever happened before? When the mic's on?
Yeah.
So we could just pound the gap.
Good.
We're not voting. So.
Todd, if you try your,
So I can go the other room.
try it with just your microphone. I'm going to turn mine off.
So this is better?
Well, it's an echo here, but
Okay, so Rick has given me a thumbs up. I think we're okay.
It's echoing.
I'm plugged in. Do you want to switch it? We're going to try to switch over to my system. Okay, it just switched. So, yep, it should.
go ahead, Todd.
Yeah.
No, just go through the regular microphone, the boardroom for microphones.
Okay, Chris, can you hear me?
Guess not.
Sean, can you
Josh,
hear me?
now you're lit up like it's connected to you. That's so weird.
All right, let me do
It's
this.
saying it's on my computer.
We are still having
Can't hear
some
you, Jody.
technical issues here.
Okay, it switched back to you.
But my microphone's not working now. My computer. It always takes a while for mine. I notice whenever we start before, I have to wait for this to.
It's lit up like it's going to you.
Please bear with us. We're still trying to work out some quirks here.
Okay, mute your Zoom mic and try to talk again through.
All right, this is a test. Are you all able to hear this?
That works.
Okay,
Ah,
we're back on.
there we are. Todd, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Josh. You all can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so thank you to Carissa and Chris for that presentation. So the way this is going to work at this point is that we're going to have commissioner questions and comments and feedback on the guidance that staff want. And then after that, we'll turn to public comment. And as I said at the beginning, we're going to have just one round because really you could see from the timeline, this is the point where we're supposed to just really give high level guidance and not get into the weeds, as it were. We'll have time to do that later. I will also note that I guess my advice for my colleagues is that you probably just best to weigh in on the parts that you you feel strongly about. We don't need to give guidance on every single thing on the list if you don't have particular guidance that you want to give for that. So with that preamble, any questions or comments or feedback for Carissa or Chris? Commissioner Courtney.
I'll go first. Could probably keep it relatively short. First off, thanks for the presentation. Very helpful. This is excellent timing. Some of us had cake out front in regards to the Ready for 100, and we also have a draft greenhouse gas reduction plan and potentially a sustainability director starting soon. I'm hopeful that all of that can be incorporated into this, as I think there's great opportunity to work on those goals and bring some of those standards to bear in here. And I see some of that already at work. One thing I noted in the schedule is that Planning Commission, EAC, and Shade Tree are not on that schedule until sort of late in the game, right before we would be advertising the ordinance. I hope that that's an incomplete schedule and we will be getting input from them much sooner.
That's a great question, Commissioner Courtney. One of the things that you can see by Chris's presentation is how many times she referenced the comp plan and referenced a lot of the other public process that we've been doing. Township staff's been a pretty continual public process through the comp plan and the zoning ordinance for like the last 5 years. The EAC, Shade Tree Commission, Planning Commission have been weighing in throughout the process. And it really took us a while just to take everything that they've already contributed before we come forward. So once we turn these into actual standards, we will be running it through all of them to make sure that what they were trying to guide us to do is actually came to be an effective standard.
Okay. Well,
and I think if I could add to that, Chris, I appreciate that comment. And we have met with the EAC. We've reported out to the EAC and to the Shade Tree Commission, and we've asked for their input. The EAC is actively working with the Pennsylvania Environmental Council on their independent audit. And we've pulled in and worked with the Shade Tree Commission on some of the recommendations that came forward tonight. And we plan to continue to work with our advisory bodies as we move this forward. So it doesn't, the project schedule doesn't highlight those meetings that we've already hit, but we definitely plan on integrating their input throughout this entire process.
Great, that's great to hear. We have some wonderful subject matter experts that have volunteered for us, and it'd be good to get their input. In terms of what I should expect, will this be like the zoning code? Will you be presenting us a section or two at a time over the next couple months? Okay, that would be excellent, so I can digest things in small pieces. With regard to the EV standards, great to see that coming forward. I guess my question was, why stop at EV ready across the board? I can see how that might make sense, that for a commercial development with a public lot, there's probably a market out there for charging companies who would want to take that final step, putting the charging port in place. But for a multifamily development with a private parking lot, why wouldn't we require the developer to get it all the way to the readiness stage?
That's a great question. And I think this is one of the areas where we will rely heavily on the EAC and their expertise for input on that. We did meet with the township solicitor, and there are some concerns with having those standards in place for single family homes. But to your point, for multifamily, it definitely seems like there's an opportunity to include that early on. So this is an area that we'll be working through and refining over the course of the next several months with the input from the EAC and our advisory boards.
Great. Great to see lots of stuff about greening, parking lot standards, buffer planning. I would add that it would be great to explore requiring native species, as well as promoting species that are great for pollinators. Getting extra green badge points tonight. On the recreation fee in lieu, on your slide, it says that the recreation space provided why the fee would have to be reasonably accessible to the development. And I guess I'd like to understand what that means.
Well, that means in the municipality's planning code, the recreational area that's set aside does not necessarily have to be open to the public because it's not being taken. The land's not being taken by eminent domain. The private property owner has the right to use that land as they see fit. So
I may have misinterpreted that. Then I was wondering if it was a requirement placed on the use of the funds if they do the fee in lieu.
Oh, for the fee in lieu, yeah. Chris, do you want to expand on that?
Sure. So when the township's taking an impact fee, there needs to be it needs to be measured to that impact that it's having. And what we found is with some of the new developments that there are certain parks that are close by. So you want to be able to have the people that are making the impact upon community facilities, recreation facilities, what are the facilities they would be using? A lot of times they're small parks, but maybe they wouldn't be using those parks. And we have now developed in the township 2 somewhat central parks, the Kinwood Heritage Trail and Rolling Hill Park, where they're also reasonably accessible. One could make the logical assumption that somebody might drive to the Kinwood Trail. So so you can support some of these other elements that doesn't just have to be the neighborhood park immediately next door to the development. If that development, you would almost be forcing the project into. So we're trying to be logical with how those funds are used.
Okay, just so I understand, let me just state my concern. We have a shortage of open space and space that's available for recreational purposes. I need look no further than our attempts at middle school fields. It's my hope that if someone is going to put up a fee as opposed to providing the space, that we in the township can use it anywhere within our boundaries that makes sense. I don't think we should be hamstringing ourselves to a certain vicinity of development because the land just may not be available. All right. I think I'll just quickly try to run through the policy questions that I had particular feedback on, and most of this is just yes, I agree. But with regard to transportation demand management, I think we should both require it, a TDM plan, and then I think we should be opinionated and incentivize certain aspects of TDM through our ordinance. Yes to expanding direct fees and yes to increasing them. On the official map, yes, we should totally expand that to the entirety of the township. As I said, we need to be looking for potential for open space and recreational space, and we should also be using it for our historic and natural preservation efforts. And then lastly, on impact studies, I think the idea of an economic impact study is a great one, particularly as geared towards thoughts around equitability in the town. Thank you, Commissioner Steiner.
Thank you, Commissioner Courtney. Any other commissioners who have questions or comments or feedback? Commissioner McComb.
Thank you, Commissioner Steiner. First, thank you and Chris and your staff for a terrific presentation. Just a couple of thoughts and comments. One is on the street trees, the volume requirements. I know my friends and former colleagues on the Shade Tree Commission have weighed in on this and have weighed in on several of these areas. And I would say if you went to the very top of their wish list, this might be the top, because it's really important to plant trees, particularly shade trees, but at the risk of sounding like Captain Obvious, a tree planted in an open space or a golf course or a suburban backyard has a much greater chance of living than one planted in a sidewalk with buildings nearby and so forth. So it's really important to have sufficient soil volume so that tree has a fighting chance of surviving. One of the problems is that we require trees in our developments, but lots of times the trees don't make it past a year or so. Shortly after the escrow funds are released, and we go through a dry summer or something, and the trees keel over, as we've seen, really even across from the township building, over by the BMT thing, there are a bunch of trees that have been dead for several years, and they basically just insufficient soil volume. So that's important. Was happy to see that the greening standards for parking lots, buffer design, and so forth. I agree with Commissioner Courtney. We want to have native trees wherever possible, but again, that's the type of thing I think the Shade Tree Commission and the EAC can weigh in on. With respect to transportation demand management, I also agree that we would want to, my view would be we'd want to require developers to do that. The question I think was whether we want to go with a requirement or incentives. And the problem I think with incentives is that it's harder to have a collective approach to it if it's purely voluntary. So I don't think we always need to be a heavy hammer and insist on developers doing things, but on something as critically important as that, I think we would. With respect to the impact study, I think I part ways with Commissioner Courtney as to whether an economic impact analysis really is necessary. I'm not really sure that that's going to be something that will be the developer will do. I think you'll have a cottage industry of consultants who will do it. I think if you've seen, you may not really get a really helpful analysis. On the other hand, there's sort of an analysis of how it impacts community facilities and so forth. I think that would be helpful. I think it's always helpful to know what developments are requiring of the township, how various services and so forth are impacted by what is taking place, school district demand, and so forth. So again, a terrific presentation, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner McComb. Commissioner Kramer.
I don't want to repeat a lot of what everybody else has said. I really appreciate this extensive presentation and packet because it helps me get up to speed on SALDO. I think that I do agree with Commissioner Courtney that in terms of the EV issue, we should require EV readiness. And I don't know if the SALDO is the appropriate place or a building code or whether just another ordinance is correct. But I very strongly believe that we should have a right to charge ordinance that allows renters or apartment dwellers the ability to charge. And it isn't necessarily going to require major upgrades on the part of the owners. It just means that if a renter wants to install a meter and a charging equipment, which is inexpensive and readily available, that they have a right to do it. And most of these things are not permanent, but they're just things that you can plug into an outlet. I think that this is something that we should, as you're working on the EV section, where this comes in, whether it comes in SALDO or whether it comes in some other ordinance or in some other fashion, I think that's something that is really important. The other thing is that as you're working on the EV aspects of this, I think that our policy should be to encourage electric vehicles as much as possible and to encourage electric vehicle infrastructure as much as possible. And so there should be as few barriers in this as you're preparing it as possible to people being able to charge because that really is the future and really is what we need to be doing as a community in order to combat climate change. I agree that the TDM should be included and possibly also with incentives. And the other thing is that the impact studies, I think that both the economic impact study and also community facilities impact study would be valuable because these are factors that we should be considering. And I also noted that in the packet, one of the thoughts that for another type of impact study was for a health impact study. And given the fact that we have adopted a health in all policies policy, I am wondering why we aren't looking more closely at considering a health impact study as part of what we're looking for, because that is really consistent with our health in all policies policy. And other than that, I think most of the other things sound like great ideas. And I think it's great work. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Kramer. Any other commissioners? Commissioner Gavin.
Thank you, Commissioner Sinai. Thank you, as everyone else said, for the presentation. Couple of points that I wanted to touch on in addition to what we've already heard. Agree on the TDM being required, but really the ones I wanted to focus on are the public space and the rec fees. The recreational fees, I've said for a while now, they're just too low. They're insufficient, and I like the idea of having that constant increase that goes along with time, but starting where we are now is insufficient. We need to really look at what the impact is, and I believe that a multiple of 2 to 3 times at least of where it is now is probably appropriate. Obviously, it has to be studied and see how it fits to what's reasonable. But I'd be surprised if we find out that a significant increase is not reasonable. In terms of public space access, we've seen in some of our developments, public space is not really public space. It's very limited. And Carissa, you touched on this, where, really getting that access right is important. Figuring out what does it truly mean to be accessible to the public. We see it in Suburban Square. They've done a wonderful job in having public space. In a lot of our other development projects, we have not seen it, where the public space is very difficult for anyone who does not live in the building to know it even exists. So that's something that I believe is truly important, that public space really is public space. Three, I was happy to see your comments about buffering. We've seen on some projects where a lot of neighbors have come in and said the buffering is insufficient. So really spending some time, that's one of the most important things we can do for the neighbors of commercial and institutional lands, that there's appropriate buffering. And it's not only, in my mind, buffering between residential and institutional or commercial, it's also between institutional and institutional, because they can be 2 very different institutional uses, or institutional and commercial. So I don't want that to be forgotten about as well. But otherwise, I think you guys are, heading down the right path, and we're in good shape. And certainly the testing makes sense. It's worth, spending that extra time to get this right and make sure we work out some of the bugs through testing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vice President.
If I can just
Commissioner O'Neill.
follow up on your point about the public space. There's a complementary project that staff is working on right now. It's been 10 years since the City Avenue ordinance was adopted, and there's a provision in the City Avenue ordinance that it needs to be audited every 10 years to make sure it's functioning. And a key part of the City Avenue was public amenities. It was making sure there was a lot of incentives, baked into the streetscape, baked into the paths, baked into those public spaces. So as part of that, we've been working with the Neighborhood Club of Ballackinwood and some other stakeholders and working through. And we just did a very thorough analysis. And Jillian Dirks, who's a planner, Jillian's really taken the lead on that and done a really thorough analysis. And we incorporated some of that in the background material that we'd incorporated into the presentation. In some ways, we're critical of ourselves. We realize there's some things we need to do better in those areas. And I think from that, it's not, could you do it better? Jillian's actually now taking this stuff apart and figuring out how to make it better. So we really have learned from that, and we'll add that to the next set of standards.
Thank you, Chris, and sorry for cutting you off. And I should note that Chris in the team have been doing a very good job working with the Neighborhood Club and Commissioner McComb on sort of seeing what the play testing of City Avenue has done and what has worked and what has not. Okay, so now we turn to Commissioner O'Neill. So Tiffany, we can't hear you. Still can't hear you, Tiffany. Did you connect audio?
Tiffany, we're unable to hear you.
So Tiffany, if you can take a look at your audio and see if you're connected or not, and in the meantime, we'll go to someone else and come back to you. Commissioner Zeloff.
Thanks, Commissioner Sinai, and thanks to the team, the staff, as well as the County Planning Commission staff, who always add a great deal when they do work for Lower Merion Township. And this is looking forward and planning for the future. It's not looking backward. And there's a lot of good ideas, but a lot for us to review. And in addition to the presentation we heard tonight, there's over 100 pages of additional information that the commissioners received. So there's a lot for us to go through and to understand. I think I heard Carissa ask a question, should we take a timeout for testing? I think you asked a question and my answer is yes. There were a number of case studies throughout the township that were very helpful, an audit of what occurred and what resulted, what we intended to have occur and what resulted is extremely helpful. And I think we need more testing like that. I was delighted to see the Bryn Mawr Village development turned out the way we intended it to turn out, and that was highlighted in that audit. I think in the complete streets category, there are some conflicts. Greening is in conflict with, at times, with sidewalks and bike lanes because wider streets can mean less greening and, of course, can mean destruction of existing greening. And there's a stormwater goal, but it also says that smaller paving widths create less stormwater. That sounds true. And that's in conflict with, the sidewalk and bike lane approach to as described. And so in a very targeted way that does not apply to the vast majority of our streets, it perhaps makes sense, but it has to be extremely targeted in my view. Greening standards, the more we implement, the more we expand. That is to the great advantage of this township. We started with the Bryn Mawr Village and the greening standards have worked extremely well. The request for policy direction, I would like to see incentives for TDM and not more rules. And I'd like to add something to TDM, as it talked about bus stops. We have many train stations in this township. We have some that are decrepit. The Haverford Civic Association has prioritized trying to work with the owner of that train station, which is Amtrak. And that is an unoccupied building with the roof that leaks. It probably needs to be the attention of our maintenance inspection. I think the Rosemont train station is in similar condition. And the train stations and the train line through this township are a vital part of transportation. As we all know, that's how this township started out. And the condition of a few of our train stations is just is in such poor shape. We should be prioritizing and working with the owners, if it's Amtrak, the users, if it's SEPTA, and the tenants, to improve those train stations. With regard to the rec fee, I think applying it to commercial development, yes. Applying it to institutional development, no. Many of our institutions have open space that they make available to the community. I think increasing the rec fees and doing so via an index going forward so that we don't have to try to deal with it every year or more is the way to go. I do have concern about expanding the official map township-wide. Having been through the official map creation for the very compact area of City Avenue, that was a lot of work. And we can try it township-wide, but maybe we should take some chunks of the township to try and do it all at once. I doubt that that's a reasonable task to proceed with. Impact studies for community facilities make sense because there likely will be an impact in certain land development. However, an economic impact study doesn't make sense at all to me. What are we going to do with the information? It's well beyond the scope of what a township should do. Employee compensation, how does that fit into what we do? So I object to an economic impact study requirement. Chris, the section on minor improvements, we do that pretty well ourselves using your judgment as B&P director. Do we really want to spend time on trying to create rules and standards for that? So maybe that's a rhetorical question for you to consider. I'm skeptical. But some really great work by many, and I look forward to continuing to go through this with staff and my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Zeloff. Chris, do you want to respond to Commissioner Zeloff's rhetorical question, or should we move on to Commissioner O'Neill?
I thought the statement stood on its own.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to try Commissioner O'Neill again.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me now?
Yeah, you're great.
Yay. I apologize about that. I'm having technical difficulty this evening. Thank you, Chris and Carissa, for the presentation. I have some questions that I will absolutely follow up by email pertaining to the timing of the stormwater fee study and how this correlates either in parallel or as a sort of a stepped version of the SALDO and how we're going to treat them. Same with the performance-based standard versus the numeric on the complete street discussion. These are questions that I'll ask separately, not this evening. But to the specific questions on feedback, so these are no specific order because my notes are busy, but yes, for additional testing, for sure. I think that that was, as a part of the last zoning rewrite, became the most crucial exercise, I think, that really led to a great product in the end, and that was because of the testing, so that's good. I would also say that on the rec fees and the fee in lieu, the current 3,000 is, I agree, maybe a little too low considering market dynamic here, and that I wouldn't want to be burdened by the updates yearly, kind of like the pool fees or other sort of set fees, and maybe do that every 2 or 3, depending on how others feel. I don't think anyone else has spoken about this yet, but I for sure would like to see the majority of the parking greening standards, stormwater standards, anything to do with shade tree or EAC, green or gray infrastructure be moved to natural features. I think that that will help clarify and simplify SALDO and have it become an easier set of documents to complement one another rather than going back and forth with same or maybe differentiated language unintentionally. I would also like to see TDM included, but with incentives. And I know that Ernie has worked so hard in sort of structuring our township in a way that supports it. And I certainly want to be supportive of it, but I also don't want to hamstring our applicants to the point where maybe it becomes more challenging to get through it. Maybe it won't, maybe it will. I just want to be sensitive to the applicant on that. And that parlays to whether or not to expand the impact studies. And I would say yes on community facilities with a specific focus on the infrastructure, that is the sewer, things that we don't always think about, curbs and things like of that nature, although I know that you're thinking bigger than that. And on the economic impact study, I'm torn on this. A couple hours ago, I was, thinking we should most certainly include it, that it's something that we have talked about for years, and the importance of getting sort of a basis for whether or not something new is actually needed, where we're not oversaturating a market. But, now I see that of the information that would give us this is probably going to be proprietary, and they're not likely to share it anyway. So it's sort of how realistic is it getting it? I would love to see it, especially on the marketing side, or, the vacancy rates, I think, is key. And that we can actually get in-house just by using our BNP staff members who focus on economic development. They have the tools available to get us that data. But so that would be my recommendation, is maybe in-house that, certainly not rely on a series of consultants, and definitely not I wouldn't necessarily rely on the developers for that, or the applicants for that. And I believe that's all my comments for now, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Neill. Any other commissioners? Commissioner Stevenson.
Thank you, Chairman. I will be very brief because a lot of things that were said have already been said, but I want to reemphasize a couple of things. One is that, you know, particularly when we're talking about as in some of these areas where there is this, you know, my self-proclamation of excessive development, part of the mantra about why we want to do this development is around having people use public transportation, walkability, and all that. One of the things that we have to put in front of those conversations about how do we promote this and brand this in a way where, if that is where we proclaim where we are, put that as a priority. And I would hope that we put that up front, like what my colleague said about the bus transportation, about the sheds and the stops, not just replacing stops, but creating these ongoing stops where we are working with SEPTA to have those that are conducive for our handicap, for our special needs, and for those folks who need that transportation in order to work in our area. The second one is, again, what my colleague, Commissioner Zeloff, talked about, the train stations and about those areas around there. It should be a priority. And it's an abomination, actually, that we are begging Amtrak and other areas to work with us on this. This should be a priority. And if we are going to make that a part of our condition, that should be in the forefront. When you talk about the rec fees, I would have to say that our rec fee issue, while I understand that we need to look at it as a global, as a township around across the front, I think that we need to also take into account that in those areas that are impacted by development, that we take in some considerations about how do we make those assessments to accommodate those needs in those areas where the developments will change the characteristics of that community. For example, if there is a development where there's what we consider this community space, which is basically in a lot of times just an open space where people can walk through and sit for a while. But if we're talking about creating these fees in lieu of, how do we be creative about looking in those particular areas of those places that are impacted and make it a priority in those particular areas. So that is all I have for the day, but thank you all for your work on this.
Thank you, Commissioner Stevenson. Other commissioners? Commissioner Churchill.
Rick, you are on mute.
There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I just have one comment about the recreation fees. It seems no matter what we do, the developer is just going to pay the money. And I think that we have to, do we want the money or do we want the recreation development? And I would prefer the latter. And so the fees should be adjusted to the point that it would incentivize the developer to really create the recreation amenities rather than just pay a fee. That's all I have.
Thank you, Commissioner Churchill. Other commissioners? Okay, so President Bernheim.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Sinai, and I'll echo the appreciation of the clear hard work that went into the presentation this evening to Chris, and everybody else who helped out. So I'm not going to talk substance as to what this is, but as to process and procedure, because clearly there are a lot of excellent comments that all my colleagues have made this evening on these areas. And for the most part, we seem to be in accord with just, maybe a couple minor, views or twists or add-ons. Maybe what we can do, Chris, not to dump anything more on your plate, but dump something else on your plate, is to see if we can get someone to put out a graph, a spreadsheet, or whatever, which capsulizes and synthesizes the comments that were made this evening on those particular items. Spread that out to everybody. It'll do two things. One, it will identify where we're somewhat uniform, where we may have some disagreements amongst ourselves to help give those policy directions. And it'll also give us a starting point to provide, more information and questions on each of these topics. because there have been a lot of, excellent suggestions here that have come up as well, and that'll help give the guidance as we go forward. So if we can figure out how to do that and then circulate it to the board, I think that'll be helpful. And
Commissioner Bernheim, our Assistant Director for Planning, Charlie Doyle, is already working on that during the meeting. He's not here, but he's behind the scenes actually putting those minutes together for you.
All right, so we'll have it before we leave tonight, right?
There's a chance. It's slim, but there's a chance.
Dan keeps us out.
All right. Okay. Thanks. I'm not surprised that you're a step ahead on that thought, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, President Bernheim. Yeah, it depends on how long my comments are, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll go next. So thank you, Chris and Carissa and staff for this. This is typically thorough, and there's great detail. And as staff mentioned, there's a lot of things in here that people have been asking for a while, and it's really good to see them coming into fruition. And I stopped copying down the names of all my fellow commissioners I agreed with, because it is basically all of them. So I'll try and be somewhat succinct. But let me just start with I think an overall goal from my philosophy here is that the SALDO is about our standards for new development. And my opinion is, in this township, we should set extremely high standards. Right, we're a built-out township. We don't get all that much new development. What we should have should be of extremely high caliber. I also think that if we get development that achieves those standards, then we should not be re-litigating that development in the boardroom. We should wave it through. We should trade certainty of execution in exchange for high caliber of development. And in my experience on the board, one of the things I feel that we have done is that we kind of see a project come through when we say, well, we wish it did this, and we wish it did that, and we wish it did that. And we should just codify what it wish it did. And when it does that, we should say, fine. And I think that is one of the things that came out of the building and planning staff survey that the development community is looking for. It will take the certainty, and we will get something of lower marine caliber. So there's a lot of terrific stuff in here. There's some things that I think we can be more aggressive on. Some of the things I think are terrific, Chris and Carissa. The street tree section, I think is terrific. I think it's going in the right direction. I would love to see additional maintenance standards. So as Commissioner McComb says, things don't just die off once they get outside the warranty period. Like, I'd like to extend that because I think he's absolutely right. I think the parking lot standards and the greening standards, again, we've had some improvement. We can have additional improvement. I think moving away from the columnar trees that don't drop branches on cars, but also don't provide shade. We should get things that actually provide a canopy on the street and in parking lots. I agree with Vice President Gavrin that we should have ways of kind of improving the public gathering space that these developments are delivering. I'm glad you're moving forwards on that. I would like to see more on the greening. I don't think we have standards in here per se for green building. I didn't see standards for green roofs. Singapore in its SALDO says anything that you pave, every square foot that you pave, you have to replace with a square foot of green. So you have green roofs, you have green balconies. Can we be more aggressive on that dimension? Can we have stronger landscape standards like sites, as Commissioner Courtney effectively alluded to? I think those are directions that we can push this in even further. TDM, I am on the camp of thinking it should be a requirement. I think our experience with incentives in the code is that they're very hard to calibrate. I think one thing that we're discovering in the City Avenue area when it comes to public gathering space is that there's been a fair amount of development incentives that have been taken advantage of in exchange for something like 3/4 of an acre of public gathering space, right? Those terms of trade are hard to get right, and we can give away a lot for little. If we care about it, we should just require it. And I agree completely with Commissioner McComb that if it's something that requires everyone to do it collectively, you just have to make everyone do it. I think that's exactly the right call. I would like to see more on alternative fuels. Can we have incentives or requirements for considering things like solar if you're going to do additional development? That may not be compatible with a green roof, but these are other things that we should be considering. I am in favor of the official map. I think we should try to at least expand it to include the areas in which we think it's really important to have community green space. I think we have incentives in some of our codes for developers to aggregate their public gathering space, but there is no focal point for them to aggregate or look them around. We need to give them some guidance and direction. There should be a map that says this is where we'd like to have it. If you're going to put some money in it, we're going to use it to buy this spot. If you're co-located with that spot, great. You choose the corner of your property that's going to be public gathering space and contribute to what's going to be an aggregated park. But we need to give some direction to people to help do that. And then I guess the last thing on here are the impact studies. I cannot support the economic impact studies. Might come as a surprise to some people. Partly that's due to the limitations of the input-output models that these things are based on. But partly it's that I'm not sure what we do with a economic impact study that says if we do development in Lower Merion, it's going to increase the number of jobs, right? It's increasing the number of jobs regionally. It is not increasing the employment rate or decreasing the unemployment rate among Lower Merion residents per se, right? And we're talking about a local development in considering the regional economic impact. And while that might be important for a regional government authority, I don't believe it's important for a local government authority. However, I do think it's important for us to assess and take into account the local impacts. And that's why we need the EFIS kind of study, the CFIS study, right? We need the community facility study. What is the effect of the development on community facilities? If there's going to be effect on local revenue, and that's important to take into account, or local sales, right? Then take that kind of thing into account. And so, those kinds of studies should be enhanced. Transit studies and traffic studies should be enhanced and brought up to modern code. TDM, it is not going to be a panacea. One of the things that was in your SALDO is that most of the TDM elements are really, they work along the edges. They are not going to solve traffic problems. And so we're just going to have to accept that that's going to be an issue. But overall, tremendous work. Thank you very much. I appreciate really all the great progress of staff. We have a couple of commissioners who have not yet spoken. Does anyone else want to go? Chris and Carissa, do you have any last comments?
Just to follow up, Commissioner Sinai, I really appreciated those comments. They were very good, but they do raise one issue I was going to throw out for the board to think about this as we're going forward, especially about greening. Staff's been working with the EAC and the Shade Tree Commission on inspections of projects that go in. Right? All of us on the Zoom call right now spend a lot of time discussing landscape plans, buffering plans, public space plans with developers. And developers agree to conditions of approval, they're wordsmithed to death, they finally go in. What happens is those landscape plans are eventually put in by the lowest bidder, right? The lowest bidder is the one guy who's planting those trees. And we have to be able to make sure that we have better inspection of that. We've been working with the township engineer. We've been working on that. We're fortunate to have Holly on our staff, who's a master's degree in landscape architecture, who's taken some of this on. Some of this, I think there's going to be a human component to this with maintenance. It's something that we're looking at in the building and planning department to be able to make sure that if we have these standards, we can back them up with staff and inspection. There has to be that follow-up with all of these codes. We're moving into different things. We've seen the building and planning department change over the last few years. We now have a historic preservation inspector, right? And Greg Pritchard, we know him as a planner, but Greg is really the inspector. Greg's making sure that these conditions of approval that come from all of the meetings that we have are actually being followed. We're going to need to do that same sort of element and heighten what we do with landscaping as well. And something we're thinking, I'm going to come back to everybody with some thoughts on that later. It's a total effort. It's just not regulation, but it's also enforcement.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I believe, President Bernheim, that concludes the business of the Building and Planning Committee this evening.
Well, thank you very much, Commissioner Sinai. And I'm just going to, at the risk of being redundant, reiterate the appreciation, Chris, of all the work from you and everyone in the Building and Planning Department. There is a reason that we're able to say that we have such good work product that comes out of this township, and and we look forward to, continuing, with that process. That actually does complete the business we have this evening. I am pleased to report that the Sixers are beating Washington 65-63. Ben Simmons is 34 points. All right, I made that part up. That's
the series total.
All right, but anyway, I thank everybody for their work this evening and wish you all a good night. We are hereby adjourned.